You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today, Steve sits down with Baroness Beeban Kidron, a member of the House of Lords in the UK and a global authority on online privacy and tech regulation. Steve and the Baroness discuss the critical importance of privacy on the internet in the age of surveillance capitalism, why we need to reframe how we talk about AI and new technology, and the problems with the UK government's current AI policy.
Baroness Kidron, delighted to have you with me on the podcast today. You sit as a crossbench peer in the UK's House of Lords, and for those of our listeners who perhaps aren't familiar with that term, crossbench peers are independent, don't represent any specific political party, and that is designed to allow you to bring a whole range of diverse perspectives and expertise to the House of Lords, and of course allows you to contribute to debates and discussions without any party political affiliations, if I've got that right.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. Delighted to be with you. And you're absolutely right. And I think that it's really actually quite critical to the work that I do in technology, particularly around children, but in AI and more generally, that we work across party and we work really on our interest area. So we have a track of people. We call ourselves jokingly the Lord's Tech Team. And it's very broad politically. But what we find is that we agree more because of the expertise, because of the understanding of what the issues are, than we do disagree on ideological grounds. So I think that the crossbenchers have been very helpful. And as a crossbencher, I've found it very helpful because I've been able to work with and against governments of all sorts.
Absolutely. You're also, of course, an advisor to the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. You're a commissioner on the UN Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development and an expert advisor for the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence. AI, something that I certainly do want to talk to you about. And you mentioned children as well there because you are, of course, a visiting professor of practice at the London School of Economics, where you chair the research centre Digital Futures for Children. Beeban, I wanted to start, though, in the area of privacy. And you've been a leading voice in online privacy for quite some while now. Why is it such an important issue today?
I think that it's an unsung hero of safety, of equity, of control between user and company. And I think that in the early open days of the internet, where we all thought no gatekeepers, everything must be open, it was conceived of as a place of equals, equal power, equal strength, equal privacy, and equal opportunity to say or not say, and see or not see. But as the internet became a place of data grabbing, data harvesting, surveillance, as Shoshana Zuboff coined it, surveillance capitalism, then the person who had the most information became the strongest person in the pack. And the harvesting of information gave way to a lot of the more toxic aspects of the technology. It is deliberately designed to keep your attention. It's deliberately designed to make you come back. Deliberately designed to know the most, to reveal the most. And in that context, actually privacy becomes an incredible tool of sort of protection for the user, particularly, as we'll probably discuss, for children who may not understand the negotiation that they're in. Because if you don't have someone's data, if you don't have someone's attention, if you're not pushing them to expose more and to do more, actually they have a less toxic experience. I felt very early on that privacy was both an important principle because information needs context and internet and digital worlds are rather bad on context. But equally, I thought it was a tool that the tech companies would understand if we started to negotiate about privacy as an agent of safety.
And certainly, I've had conversations with Shoshana, as you mentioned there. The other person that I found interesting in this particular space was Dr. Anne Cavoukian, who was the Information and Privacy Commissioner for the province of Ontario for many years, where we talked about the concept of privacy by design to try to overcome some of these challenges, because regulation, in my understanding or my experience of it, is always going to lag behind. There is always going to be a reluctance on the part of the regulator to put something into legislation because it may change. And certainly if we look at technology, it moves so very quickly. How are they possibly going to keep up?
Well, let me put those two thoughts together, actually, because one of the very first things I did as a parliamentarian was introduce something called the Age-Appropriate Design Code.
Right.
And what it was a manifestation of GDPR privacy rules that said a child has to have a higher bar of privacy because they may not know or may not understand the exchange that they're engaged in. And the Age-Appropriate Design Code does exactly that thing. It says, here are 15 things that the company must do by design and default to enhance the privacy of children under the age of 18. And it was a really interesting, novel piece of regulation. And I don't know whether this is the occasion, but it was politically very difficult to get over the line. But having got over the line, we've now seen it play out. And we've seen it play out in two different ways. One is, and this is in support of what you've just said, one is that in a recent review of its effectiveness, we found that all the things that the tech companies did by design and by default, all the things that were default settings have worked brilliantly. And all the responses that they had, which was to give more information or parental controls or tools for the user to choose this or that, have worked very poorly or not at all. So in support of what you've just said, absolutely, I think privacy by design, in fact, safety by design, in fact, equity by design, fairness by design, rights by design, anything that we want to impose that is a societal requirement of technology must be by design, otherwise it doesn't work. But I think the thing I'm going to push back on, in part, in small part, in fact, is that regulation can't be smart, that regulation can't say, oh, this is the outcome we want, now you go and design it to get to that outcome. And I think that one of my sadnesses is that so few politicians all around the world truly understand technology. And so what they keep on doing is trying to go reach for the prescriptive, reach for the content, reach for what I call the last decade's problem, looking over your shoulder instead of looking forward. And absolutely, that should be by saying, okay, society says a child is a child until they're 18. Therefore, by design, you must not have such and such impact, whether that is addiction, whether that is sending toxic material that suggests that they self-harm, whether that is really adult content, whatever it is, you must not do it because they're under 18 by design. And I think that for me, the biggest issue in that is, on the one hand, the privacy, and on the other hand, the addictivity. And if we concern ourselves primarily with those two issues rather than the content issues, I think we get to a better place much quicker.
It's interesting that you make a big point around the societal impact of this, because, of course, the two go hand in glove, don't they? You can't divorce them anymore. Our children are brought up in a technological age. We see babies being given iPads and tablets and so on. And so to a certain extent, one could say that this has been a bit of a train smash waiting to happen. And I think one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that certainly if we look back to when the internet first came of age, we missed the opportunity to be regulating right at the beginning. And indeed, it still isn't regulated effectively at all. Have we missed the boat on this one as well, do you think?
Yes and no. If we had acted quicker, we would be further along the line of something that is sensible. In one sense, we are laggards. But I think that it's really important to say, to feel, and to act on the principle that actually, first of all, not all children who are going to use the internet have been born and are yet using it. So whatever we do now helps those in the future. Yeah. And I think secondarily, because of my particular trajectory, or what I call sometimes my inbox of horror, if we can act and help one child, even just one, then it wasn't a waste of our time. Now, in fact, I'm much more optimistic than that. And I've gone through my own political journey where in the beginning, when I raised a sort of an alarm in 2013 and said, hang on a minute, we've invented a technology without thinking about the kids. We're treating them as if they're adult and they can't cope, literally with the demands on their attention, their time, their maturity. They just don't have any of those things accessible to them, and at that time people treated me like a middle-aged woman who didn't get the new rock and roll, and nowadays everyone goes, oh gosh, how did you understand so swiftly? So I think we're over the thing of deciding whether we've got a problem. We still argue about how to deal with it. But I would say, and I think it's important to say in the context of your podcast and the kinds of people who listen to your podcast, I feel like I'm waving that flag again here now about AI. And we do have an opportunity now to consider how we build a world with AI in it, unless we want to make the very same mistake and let, TikTok and Instagram be mum and dad. We're in severe danger of letting friend bots and AI systems over which we have far less control become the new mum and dad. So I think we have to learn from the past and say, hang on a minute, we could be a little bit more robust than we were before. And I am concerned that the geopolitics of the moment are working very severely against that thought.
You've certainly highlighted how AI enhanced content and recommendation systems can harm young users. I'm curious, how should regulation and platform design adapt, in your view, to prioritize age-appropriate safety by design?
It's funny, in great detail, and if anyone's absolutely interested, the Five Rights Foundation, which I funded, it's a charity and it works globally, mainly to help other jurisdictions who don't have institutional capacity draft and implement regulation or treaty obligations and so on to children. And earlier in the year, we launched something called the Children and AI Design Code. And it literally sets out a protocol of how you might consider children in AI design. And it was very funny because at the launch, there was a sort of a very wry comment from someone who had been centrally involved in the AI Act in Europe. And he said about Five Rights Code, he said, this is a Ferrari of codes. You may have to settle for a Fiat. And what he meant, and I thought it was a fabulous thing. But in terms of just saying, okay, how do we start to think about this? It basically takes three sort of fundamental approaches. And I think these are so fundamental that actually when I say them, you think, why not? So the first thing to say is that children have rights. Yeah,
right.
They've had rights since 1989, formally set out in the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in 2021, myself and a group of experts drafted what is called a general comment and sets out how they apply and their relevance to the digital world. And the reason that rights are important is that they're not just the safety issue, which is obviously very important to a lot of parents, to teachers and so on. But actually, it's about the right to have your own voice heard. It's the right for freedom of thought, which actually raises interesting questions in an AI system. It's the right to unfettered information.
Right.
So in an insecure information environment, that's interesting. A right to an education, a right to health, and so on. And so you can see that some of the advances that AI brings may actually be rights enhancing if they are equitably given. But equally, it raises some interesting issues about what good looks like for a child that is not about just simply banning and kicking them off all the time, which is a sort of a go-to. The second thing it does is it recognizes that children are different at different ages. And I think we're very quick to go child. And then I don't know whether you've got an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 17-year-old in your mind when you say the word child, but the chances are you've got whatever child is closest to you in your personal life in your mind. But actually, I run groups of children, workshops. I did one actually on Saturday. The children came from Kenya and Australia and Germany and US and so on, all over the world. And we talk about how it manifests in their world. And of course, in the global south, those children who came from that area were talking about the problem of sharing devices in families and what that means to them, right? Because the adult and the child is not separated by device. Yeah. So some of our Western solutions don't work. And then some of the other children were talking about, the pressures at school to be online all the time in ed tech situations, and saying it started off ruining friendship, it then ruined the way to school, then it ruined their social life, and now it's ruining learning because they're never, ever allowed to be off. So that was an interesting two perspectives. So there's this thing about not all children are the same. And the third, and in a way the most obvious, but the least attended to, is that children actually need to do a variety of things to develop. They just do. It's very difficult to learn to walk if you don't learn to crawl. Some kids do it, but very few. It's very difficult to understand the concept of risk until you're 13 to 15. But at that time, some kids run to risk and some run away from risk. But we actually don't expect certain maturities, physical, emotional maturities, to develop. And actually, when we think about AI, we have to think about child development goals and make sure we're not interrupting them. And if I just finish on this thought, which is you already mentioned, babysitting very young children, I think it's broadly recognized now that there is a COVID time bomb, amongst child development. I would assert to you that actually we've got a much bigger time bomb coming, because ever since COVID, and ever since the world has been in this slightly downward spiral relating to public services and the sort of fragmentation of communities, children being babysat with screens. A lot of nurseries do song time and story time using YouTube. You are separated from your family and you talk to them, on FaceTime, etc., etc. And this is getting in the way of a child's ability to do other things. And so it's not how much screen time is good or bad. It's actually the opportunity cost. And it turns out that as human beings, we learn from each other. I can see if you're interested in what I'm saying. Over here, looking at a screen, I don't learn that lesson from you. Yeah. I can see that I have the strength to stand up if I pull myself up a ladder. Yeah. But if I'm always pacified by flickering cuts, very fast flickering cuts and some buzzes and noises, I don't even try. And what we're seeing, and this is a piece of research that my colleagues at LSE are very engaged with right now, what we're seeing coming into nursery, coming into school in the very lowest classes, is children who really are so underdeveloped in their language, in their physicality, in their emotional understanding, and in their social ability. And that is a time bomb. So when we think about technology, we just have to think, and when we think indeed of regulation, I like the phrase, it's socio-technical. We have to think about what kind of world we want, what kind of world is good for us, what kind of world benefits most people, and then we build ourselves a pathway to do the most we can in that direction. I'm an 80-20 person. Unless we begin to admit that not everything that technology does is a benefit, not everything technology does is necessary, and not everything technology does is progress. It manifests in all those ways: benefit, progress, good, social good, personal good, individual good, financial good. But actually, I think that not everything needs to be replaced. And I think one of the things for the more industry listeners is go for good old-fashioned AI is actually much, much better and less resource intensive than Gen AI for some tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you replace it except to sell something commercially? Some tasks are better done like that. You know what? Some tasks are actually better done by a child standing up and walking across the room. And it's that basic. So I think when you look at the Children and AI Code, here I have a copy, as it happens, I'm about to take it into the Lords in a minute. When you look at that, it helps you put that perspective around development, and you ask some very basic questions. And one of the great joys of my life in this policy area is that almost every time I've spoken to an engineer, and over the last 13, 14 years, I have spoken to many hundreds now, they always go, I never thought about it like that. Mm. And when they do think about it like that, they are instinctively problem solvers. And actually, they're not being asked to solve the problem of what world we want for our children. They're being asked to solve optimization for attention for other reasons. They have other things that they are being asked to solve. But actually, if you give them the problem, they're very keen to solve it. And that's why we've ended up doing quite a lot of work with the IEEE, creating standards and frameworks and regulatory frameworks, as well as voluntary ones for people, just because engineers have actually helped us think about how to think about it.
It's a reframing, isn't it, Beeban? So often we hear that technology is the answer. Now, what's the question? And I think that is the real issue that we're grappling with. I mean, in the UK, we see that all the time with some of the policies that the current government is putting forward. And so very often people talk to me about, okay, if that is the way that we're going, how are we going to educate, train, not just children, but people in middle age, people in pensioners, for instance, because we are alienating potentially a whole section of society. And that, for me, is one of the issues that we don't seem to be coming to terms with as well.
Listen, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a wonderful phrase someone taught me once. I violently agree. Violently agree. It's a really interesting question more broadly, but it becomes acute, doesn't it? As if in technology, that why do we think that we stop learning when we leave school?
Right.
Because I don't know about you, but I have learnt almost everything I now know since I left school. I learn day in, day out, and I'm thinking of a meeting that I had last week about AI and human alignment. And in that meeting were people from all the big companies, the names of which you all know, as well as academics from all over the world and policymakers. And the way that information got exchanged, so that actually some people were really talking about what does it mean to be human and which bits of humanity do we want to preserve. But other people are talking about what bits of technology would be useful to preserve humanity. And this sort of exchange. And by the end of it, I think all the emails I got said that was the most exciting and compelling and uplifting conversation I've had about AI, because actually I spend most of my working life absolutely terrified. So I think it's not only actually learning to use, I think it's also learning to talk about technology in a way that you feel confident that you can actually say, do you know what? I really love this thing, but I'm not up for that.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that this is part of the problem. And I know you just referred to it in passing, but I think that the government has made a colossal mistake in being sort of boosterish about AI, as if it presented no problems, as if it presented a myriad of solutions, which I think most people listening would say are optimistic at best, unproven as we stand here, and very possibly going to disappoint. Yeah. And I think that it would be much better if we did take, as I said earlier, this socio-technical approach and say, what do we need? Where are the gaps? What can it solve? And absolutely this thing, and I think about it very specifically in regard to EdTech, there are a lot of schools who are being slightly bullied into providing edtech in the classroom, and you actually look at what it's doing, it's Victorian rote learning with good graphics.
Right.
It's actually undoing all the lessons of the last 30 years of pedagogy, which say you start with what a child knows, that they have the opportunity to try, that they learn from others, that the teacher acts in a more sort of as a guide, as a conductor, rather than the giver of information. All of these things have helped education over the last few decades. And here we are using technology that's supposed to be the solution, as you said, to a problem that maybe didn't exist, or perhaps to the wrong problem, which is how do you pay teachers? You're downgrading the actual experience for the child. And these things, I think people need to be able to be confident to speak about with knowledge. So it's not just like the old days where we all had to learn Excel and how to doctor our own pictures, hopefully to make ourselves 20 years younger, that we also have to understand the purposes of technology and which purposes are being replaced. And I think in that regard, the UK is catastrophic in its messaging, because we're saying they've got it all, we want it all, it will solve everything, there's nothing we can do here, and there's nothing worth saving. And those are all wrong messages in my view, because I think that actually we have a grand tradition of innovation. We have a grand tradition of regulation. We're relatively good at it. And we have the most extraordinary data sets that hold immense value. And if we created a sort of a trusted framework for some of those things, I think we'd both make money and create jobs. And as job displacement comes, we might actually create new ways of being. At the moment, it's all a bit, if it ain't AGI and it ain't an American company, we don't believe in it. And I think that's a horrible mistake. And people are very anxious.
No, I think they are. I think one of my concerns as well is the ability of AI companies, AI engines to just scoop up such vast volumes of information, to then morph them into whatever it is that they choose to, and then spit them back out again to people, to the point you've just been making, who don't understand that they need to be viewing it with a somewhat cynical eye, I would say. I mean, I always talk about AI as being a tool, and lots of people disagree with me on that. But for me, it is. If I was a carpenter, I wouldn't simply be handing over the job of making a cabinet to my hammer and chisel. I would be using that. And I think that is the appropriate way to be using AI. Now, you've been exceptionally critical as well, I think, I would say justifiably, in terms of some of the AI regulation proposals in the UK, especially around copyright, because of the power and the control that they could give to AI developers and the impact that has on the creative industries. And we've had no end of artists and creators come out and speak passionately in that area, and John being one, Sir Paul McCartney another, and there are many, many others. How do you think the work of artists and creators be protected in the age of AI going forward? Because you put forward a number of amendments to the bill, and I think not all of them, particularly around transparency, were accepted, if I'm right.
No, they weren't accepted by the government. They were accepted by the Lords in overwhelming number. And as you say, we ran quite a strong campaign with many of the artists you've mentioned, and indeed other people, from Oscar-winning authors to many of the people whose plays, whose art, whose sculpture we have enjoyed over the years. I think that there's two things to say here. One is that in and of itself, it is hugely important to protect the idea of copyright. Copyright has two facets. One is it is a moral right because it is an expression of your humanity. What you write, what you draw, what you sing is yours. It is you. It is a manifestation of you. So it comes with, and in fact, in human rights law, it is specifically stated that it is your moral right to determine how that is used. Because if I give up my very personal experience to make a piece of art, the idea that someone could not only scrape it, use it, forget about the money for a second, but they could use it in a context that really made me very unhappy, to say the exact opposite.
Absolutely.
And so on. So I think there's the moral right. And then, of course, if you can't earn a living from your creativity, then you don't earn a living. And we really don't want creativity and creative output to be the preserve of the inherited wealthy. A, there's not that many of them, and B, we don't want them to represent all of human experience in all its forms. So it's actually really important to find a settlement in which creative lives can be independently, we don't want an Arts Council grant to give away what the government thinks is good art. We want to be able to earn a living. So I think those are the two principles. And we have a copyright thing, and it's also very technically possible. I mean, all over the world, AI companies have been making deals with various institutions. It is technically possible, and it is absolutely right to license things. So actually, all you really got to do is stop the steal, basically. So I think there's less problems than people would have you believe. What I think is more complicated is that those people who are really at the frontier of AI development, who are really going for AGI, there's only a few of them, a handful. And what they say is, we can't stop to work out who owns what. And I think it's really important to realize that if you don't talk to government, who actually talk a slightly stupid game on this, but you talk directly to industry, they say, yeah, we really don't mind paying a little bit. We like art too.
Yeah.
But actually, it's this much of the pile. And we are worried about, of course, they mentioned China, but they're also worried about the competition between each other. And they're all going to be the winner of this race for power, for dominance, for riches, and of course, for technical breakthroughs. Now, there's a lot of different views around here. You will know all of them. I think it's important to say many people think that the really big breakthroughs will come from much smaller and more specialized models. A lot of people think that they exaggerate what their models will be able to do, and that actually getting that last mile of innovation is always the difficult one. Look how long we've been waiting for the autonomous car. We were children when it was first suggested.
That's absolutely right.
That last mile, that last clever bit that human beings do so well is not necessarily going to be so fast. To sacrifice everything to this is very problematic. And I think that what I see, first of all, we do have a political fight. We do have to win this for the creative industries. And the government, although they rejected my amendments, they made a lot of promises in lieu. So now we're seeing whether the promises in lieu of within a consultation, within working groups, within Parliament, will result in something that we find acceptable. That will be the question. But in the meantime, I think it is worth those of us, and you've already indicated where you sit on this, those of us who do care about how it is we are represented in the new AI world should be thinking rather more carefully about publicly held data, about NHS data, about CCTV data, security. That is one of my bugbears. No one has worked out yet. The tech companies have, and maybe the government has, but the public has not yet worked out that actually we have more CCTV footage than anywhere in the world. And one of the promises is to make policing cheaper and easier, by actually running models and being able to kettle people and so on. And you go, well, you can be in balance. There are people who think that is a travesty of civil liberties, and there are people who are saying, oh, that makes policing more efficient. However, what we also have to think about is then what happens when that technical possibility built on our CCTV allows police forces all over the world to run programs to kettle populations. How does that play out in Gaza? How does that play out in Northern Ireland? How does this play out in central LA, like we've seen recently, and so on and so forth, Syria, wherever? I'm not making any specific point. I'm making a general point, which is that seems to me quite a decision to hand it over. I think the basis on which it's handed over, and also the economics on which it is handed over, both of those things, the UK's broke, a lot of our things are very valuable, and that politically some things are unacceptable. And where do we have the opportunity to democratically say, no, not that? We don't think so. And that may not be the bar for everyone, but the bar may be something else. It may, in fact, be about choosing who gets kidneys. The truth of the matter is that we're all a little bit used to, albeit patchy and disappointing democracy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If that is not going to be the bar, if the bar is that 5 people in the world have all the toys, that's very problematic. So I think we've got some very big questions to ask. And I think all of those things have what I call security and sovereignty aspects to them, and that we have to think about where we sit in the geopolitics of technology. And I think if I am able to say this, that when I read the submissions to the United States AI strategy from OpenAI, from Google and so on, I just got this immediate, incredible picture of the East India Company. And that's what they were describing.
Right.
They were describing a colonizing technology in which the US gave institutional and military support for the delivery, not just of services, but of values and of economic extraction. And I think that is something that is not being taken seriously by the community, by Europe, and certainly by the UK government.
I would certainly agree, and plenty of food for thought in what we've just been talking about. Beeban, thank you so much for your time. Very interesting. I'm sure that our listeners will be taking away perhaps more questions than answers. And for me, I think that's a very good thing. So, Baroness Kidron, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.
Special thanks to this week's guest, Baroness Beeban Kidron. We'll be back with another new episode next week. In the meantime, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and we'd be pleased if you'd consider sharing the episode. To become an ISF member, get in touch with Steve directly at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.